the numbers are going up.
All right, welcome everybody. It's great to see you here today. My name is Melissa Nahn, President and CEO of the American Composers Orchestra. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's professional development session, which is part of a series that we are presenting in connection with our Earshot Composer Advancement programs and in partnership with the American Composers Forum. Today's session is on orchestra etiquette, and I am joined today by composer Aaron Jay Kernis. Pulitzer Prize and Grammy-Award winning composer Aaron Jay Kernis draws artistic inspiration from a vast and often surprising palette of sources, amongst them the limitless color spectrum and immense emotional tangle of the orchestra, cantorial music in its beauty and dark intensity, the roiling drama of world events, and the energy and drive of jazz and popular music. We are thrilled to have him here today. And we are also going to be welcoming some of our Earshot composers and any of you as well on screen with us if you would like to ask a question. So please don't hesitate to raise your hand digitally. That will let us know that you would like to come on screen with us to participate in the conversation and ask a question. You are also welcome to use the Q&A button below the video to submit your questions to us as panelists. And we will have some time to answer your questions towards the second half of the webinar. You are welcome to also use the chat function to interact with your fellow attendees. And this panel will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel and American Composers Forum's website. I also want to make sure that I thank those who have made this webinar series possible: the American Composers Forum, the Stephen R. Gerber Trust, the Virginia B. Tolman Foundation, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, individual donors, and of course our ACO staff: Lindsay Working, Aidan Feldkamp, Stephen Bear, Derek Rommel, and Sydney Cusick. So without any further ado, Aaron, welcome. It's great to see you today.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Melissa, and great to be doing this.
Well, I'm super thrilled. And, you know, one of the things that is so exciting about you as a composer is that, like ACO, you've made such a great part of your career being about bringing forth composers into the field. A lot of training programs in Minnesota and many other places. And we're just really thrilled to have you here today. I know that you've built many, many techniques around great rehearsal, etiquette, behaviors, relationship building, all of that wonderful stuff that makes the art happen. So we're thrilled to learn from you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I know that one of the best ways to start learning is through stories, right? And I'm curious
Definitely.
if there are any stories you might want to share. I'm sure you've seen it all, most likely.
Well, I have
rehearsal.
a couple that I won't say, and a couple that I will. My first, I won't talk about my first reading, but my first orchestra reading when I was when I was 23 years old, nearly 39 years ago. And hard to believe, feels like yesterday. But I'm not going to talk about that first one. But what I will say is, of course, I've had a range of great experiences and a range of really kind of frustrating and a little horror stories in a way. But I guess to the good, I've worked with lots of conductors who really engage the composers in rehearsal, sometimes inviting them onto the stage to talk to the musicians, to actually give comments directly to the musicians. Other ones who prefer that to occur more in the background, more in between rehearsals, during break, things like that, where the conductor themselves runs the situation. And certainly for me, I felt most welcomed, most happy when I could go up on the stage with the conductor there and interact with musicians. But that's the maybe more rare, because rehearsal time is very, very precious. But I will say a couple of the less good situations. One not so bad, where very lovely conductor I worked with. After rehearsal, I went up to him and I said, Maestro, section A, whatever, section S, could you move these ahead a little bit, and section L, whatever, it's a little too fast, whatever. Could you do this, Maestro? Thank you very so much. And I gave other comments which he gave to the musicians. So next rehearsal, tempos were just the same. no change at all. I went back to him next rehearsal, and in with other language, I said the same thing. Performance happened, no change whatsoever. And actually, there was another rehearsal, so I just realized that it's not just that I had to back off, but that I realized the conductor had learned the score his way. And even though it was a world premiere, and I consider the score is the document, the score is everything. He learned it the way he heard it, and there was really nothing I could do about that until the next performance, hopefully, with another situation. So that, again, he was very pleasant about it. Lovely situation, except for that. Some more, one extreme situation that I and a number of other composers went through at the same time was a conductor who just would not even acknowledge pretty much that I existed and the other composers existed. And it was such, this wasn't so much with me. I eventually, it was so, so concerning. I just had never had anyone just act like I wasn't there. And it was very clear he was the maestro, and that was it. The buck stopped with him. But I saw situations with the same conductor where one composer actually pushed past him, got up on the podium, and gave his notes to the musicians because he just simply wouldn't have it that this conductor ignored him. And I saw another composer who actually cried in rehearsal because it was so far from what she intended. So hopefully this will never happen to you again. This was a long time ago, before the change of millennium. So hopefully situations like this are few and far between.
Wow. Wow. Well, we'll get into some of the specifics, of course, as we go, but I'm dying to know what happened when that conductor, or when the composer got up on the podium and gave those notes.
There was no fist fight. Nothing like that happened. He gave his notes, the musicians got them, and they went on.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was quite a moment.
I can only imagine. So as we go through today, you're going to see shades perhaps of some moments of those stories, ways to get ahead of them, ways to address them when they occur. But I really appreciate your willingness to share some of these with names and faces changed to protect the innocent.
Yes. And it's, believe me, that's an extreme. That was an extreme.
Yeah.
And I have never since that time heard of anything remotely like that happening again. I think that's the far reaches.
Yeah, definitely. And, let's talk about what it takes to actually prepare for the moment, right? Because there's so much that happens before the first rehearsal that you have to put in place in order to set the stage for a successful process. So I wonder if you can share a little bit about what you're thinking about, what you're preparing before that first rehearsal happens.
Absolutely. And I want to say, if those of you watching get one thing from this, hopefully it's the next thing I will say, which is your parts. Your parts are your introduction to or the musician's introduction to you. If the parts are in bad shape, if the page turns are wrong, if there are mistakes, they're not going to think as well of you. They're not going to think you're as professional as hopefully you are. Whatever it takes, the page size, the relationship of the staff size to the page, as I said, the page turns, all of these things. That is the most crucial way that musicians get to know you and, of course, the music. So I have included in the chat a very crucial document from the Music Orchestra Librarians Association, or known as MOLA. It's their series of guidelines for preparation of scores and parts. They're very compact. You should study them and essentially just know them through and through. And I just can't stress more how those parts are crucial. So another thing that's crucial in the process of a reading and performances as well is your relationship to the librarian. in the orchestra. Sometimes they will make the parts better, they will reformat if they need to, but you can't rely on that. You have to really learn how to do this the best way yourself. But there's a lot of stuff that you can learn from an orchestral librarian. You can get a sense of who to speak to, who to ask questions of, usually either the librarian, the assistant or associate conductor, maybe a music liaison or composer in residence. So many of the questions you might have that will influence the way that you act and speak in rehearsal should initially be asked. If you want to find out and not be surprised, what's the conductor like? How much time do I have? Do you know if the conductor will accept me to go on stage and present notes to the musicians? Things like this. You can at least get some cues. They may not know everything, but music librarian is a really crucial part of this information gathering.
For sure. And I want to unpack a couple of things that you just said. So first of all, that idea that people make so many judgments about you before you even arrive at that rehearsal based on what your parts look like. That's another thing that's really similar to what we think about on the performance side, that an audience member makes a lot of judgments about what the concert's going to be like based on what the website looked like, or whether it's easy to park, or whether the bathrooms were clean, like before anything even happens. So it's just really helpful for us as artists of every kind to be thinking about how that information, those materials, that experience are going to be received before you show up, because it really sets the stage for how people will interact with you. And then the other piece of preparation that you mentioned is that idea of how you really get to know the lay of the land, because so much of what we're talking about here, even those stories that you shared, every orchestra, every conductor, every set of musicians behaves differently. The more you can immerse yourself in that culture and know what you're in for before rehearsal one, the less you will be surprised, right? So you've mentioned some things that you have asked of librarians, which I should say, librarians are our best friends. They're wonderful people for every reason you discussed. Is there anything else that you have asked to sort of get a sense for the vibe of interaction or other things? Is there anything else that might be helpful for composers to know as they're walking into an orchestra relationship for the first time?
That's a good question. I mean, as I kind of implied, the general vibe is very important. The more you can learn about how a conductor runs a rehearsal and how they might run a situation with a visiting composer is pretty crucial. Pretty crucially gotten from, as I said, librarian, composer in residence, associate conductor, things like that. Something I neglected to mention about your parts, which is, again, utterly crucial, is proofreading. And also that it's also pretty crucial that you know your own score, every detail, every tempo, because questions will come to you that you need to be able to answer in a very short amount of time. I'll get into the time question about rehearsals a little bit later. But there's some people that are great at proofreading their own parts, and a lot of other people who are really better served looking to other people, looking whether it's to friends, to actual professional proofreaders. And I would say the more, the higher up that is, the more impactful whether it's a rehearsal or a reading or whatever, that is maybe the more high pressure situation, I would say, the more important it is for you to even to think of putting resources into having proofreading done. So you know that when the parts hit the stands, they are perfect or as close to perfect as possible. A recent situation that I went through is my first time working with the St. Louis Symphony. I decided to hire an outside proofreader because I just wanted that. I didn't want to have any question that there were any issues with the parts. So I hired an outsider.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, the idea of hiring an outsider to look at that, of course, that takes resources, right? And we're seeing some questions in the chat about that. You know, if there are any sort of accommodations that are needed, or if there are resources perhaps that the composer doesn't have, you know, that can be a tricky question because what we're looking at is a lot of judgments being made. They may or may not be correct about, how the composer will actually interact in the room, but nonetheless, that is going to be present. One of the questions that I see in the window here is, what would be the best way to ask for accessibility needs when you work with an orchestra? I have PTSD and need time to think through what is happening, and I may dissociate or zone out during conversation. Who would be the contact person to arrange this in a professional setting?
Let's see. I'm not certain whether that would, let's see. Trying to think up the staff ladder, whether that's a health and human resources kind of question, or whether it's I don't know if that's an artistic administrator role. I'd have to I'm afraid I'll have to turn to you, Melissa, for kind of more administrative look at that question.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the question. I would say that whoever your primary contact is at the orchestra, if that is someone that you are comfortable with, just speaking to, hey, this is something that I'm dealing with. Is there a person that would be best for me to speak to about this? Do you know what I mean? Because every organization of different sizes, some don't even have an HR person, some do. Some will have someone who is on production or someone who is actually the liaison to the conductor. Like, every orchestra has sort of a different machinery around this. The biggest thing is whoever you feel like you have the most trusting relationship with, just to be open and candid about what your needs are and what would be most helpful. I would say outside of the rehearsal context, far in advance probably will give you the best shot of success at being able to figure out how an accommodation can be made. And also, as Aaron was saying, we'll give you something of an idea of what the baseline is for interaction within that orchestra and how different that might be from what the actual baseline is. You know what I mean? So it's a very nuanced question, and I really appreciate you asking that. And then the other question that was coming up around the parts is sort of what we got to earlier, just this idea of, there's almost a sense in which that might be an ableist point of view, like saying your parts have to be really perfect, before you get to rehearsal. Is there any way to get around that? Let's say you don't have the resources to get them to the right spot. Is there anything else that you might recommend for composers who are having trouble getting someone else to proof and those other things?
Yeah. Then it becomes really a question of a skill that you need to develop for yourself, that you need to go slowly in a series of passes through the parts. For example, to isolate different elements each pass. So first pass, you make sure all the measure numbers are correct, that there aren't suddenly a dropout. And this happens pretty rarely with computer engraving programs, but it can still happen unexpectedly, where there's a glitch or a change of measure numbers unexpectedly, and some deviation between one part and the score, et cetera, et cetera. So if you do one pass that's just measure numbers, and the second pass, say you proofread just the notes and don't worry about the dynamics or the rehearsal numbers. That way you can focus on one element at a time. Now, of course, it's very hard often to find people that are experienced with proofreading. Sometimes all it takes is with other composer friends, if they have a piece coming up, you help them with that. You get a group of people together and you have a proofreading party. That's what we used to do in Minnesota very often. There are different ways, whether it's barter or whether it's just a favor, or whether it's learning how to do it yourself. And it's a very good training to develop the kind of accuracy and accuracy control, in effect, for your materials.
Yeah, that's I love the idea of a proofreading party. And, we all know anytime we're so close to a work, it's harder for us to see the errors in it. So I think that it's so great to have help when it comes to that. So I want to come back now to that relationship building piece. So I'm curious about, some of the relationship building process with conductors, right? You may encounter many different personality types. What are some of the things that you think about and navigate along those lines?
Well, let me jump back one step, which is to the assistant or associate conductor. In a great many situations, and as you go up to more and more major orchestras that have, just concerts every week, for most of the year, and conductors that are flying. Most conductors fly all over the place anyway. But if you have fewer services, if the conductor lives in the area, maybe if they're not flying around as much, maybe they'll have a little bit more time for you. But in any case, you getting in touch with the assistant or associate conductor, if there is one, to get more of a lay of the land. They can really be your friends, both in that situation and for the future. That's one of the most crucial kinds of relationship building, I think, in this situation, much more so than the actual music director, because they have so little time, and that can happen more over, hopefully, repeat situations. But to start with the assistant conductor, the librarian, as we said, or any kind of composer liaison to know the orchestra better, know the situation better, all that. Hopefully, again, every situation is different. If it's a reading, like an earshot reading, I'm hoping that there's some in advance ability to be in touch with a conductor. Some meetings before the fact, hopefully as a group, you say hello. Maybe they allow the composers to go on stage and speak to the orchestra and introduce themselves. That's really, that varies from orchestra to orchestra and conductor to conductor. But one of the things I hinted at in the stories that I initially told is there are many different approaches that conductors take, from the most friendly and the most open to the most closed. I think the thing you might come into contact with most commonly is whether a conductor will allow you to give comments directly on stage to the orchestra, or whether they prefer that to occur just between you and them with a list. Or comments that the conductor then can give to the orchestra. Another way is where that list goes through the librarian, that you give the conductor some, but ones that are very specific to parts that the conductor may not have time to put out there. You can pass that information through the librarian, so those changes can be made. And this is assuming that you have more than one shot at this, more than one rehearsal. And then, of course, you have at the back end, the conductors who really only want to run the show and don't want so much of your involvement. But hopefully there are far fewer of these situations than one would have thought a couple of decades ago.
For sure. And I'm seeing another thumbs up in the chat, basically saying, I didn't even think about the librarian's role in support. A lot of people don't think about the librarian's role in helping you get parts ready, yes, but also all that relationship building and even programming. A lot of librarians are influential in terms of programming because they have so much of an encyclopedic knowledge of what is out there. So they're really your best friends, which is really great. I wonder about, now we're starting to get ourselves closer to the beginning of the start of rehearsal. What about tools? What are some things that you want to make sure you have with you when you're in the space?
Now, I show you this rather than this. This is great for you, but to have a list of comments down an 8.5, 11 or 11 by 14 gets kind of scary. That's why I like these little pads, because you can tear them off easily and they don't have that many. There's enough room, but it's not too scary for the conductor to get these. Another crucial thing, very crucial, is the red pencil. Now, of course, you can use other colors. Some composers use many colors for different reasons. Use, green for tempos and red for notes, and there are many ways of doing this, and also pencils, of course. Now, this is a little hard to manage. It can be. I like to take a little metronome with me that's silent, specifically one that I can tap that will give me the tempo nearly right away. I don't find personally that online or app metronomes work as effectively as these little devices. They take either a little bit more time, or they have ads, or various things that kind of get in the way of their use for me. So those are important, but you kind of want to hide those, I think. It's important to be able to know if something feels really off in terms of tempo, where it roughly is, so you can have some sort of gauge. But, I wouldn't kind of go around a rehearsal, waving your metronome exactly. It's a little, it doesn't send the right message exactly. So those are the basic tools: red pencil, pencils, some sort of pad, and of course your score. Now, one of the major issues I'm getting ahead of myself, is about how to keep notes and how to take notes for yourself. And then the issue of what to give to the conductor or players or whatever. But we'll get to that in a second. I want to step one step back to at the beginning of rehearsal. It's very crucial that you sit in the right place in the hall. Now, a lot of times orchestras will set an area aside, and they'll put some kind of either a barrier or delineation of where composers are supposed to sit. But it's very important that to effectively use the very tight time of rehearsal, you want to be close enough so you can hear. So it's close enough so you can get to the stage if you need to. And so if the conductor speaks to you, you can speak to them quickly. Far enough away so you can hear the full acoustical bloom of the orchestral sound. So you really get a good sense of what's going in the orchestra. And you have to balance that because every hall is different. That's another thing to ask the assistant conductor or librarian, whatever, to say, where's the best place in the hall for me to sit that I can also get up on stage easily if necessary. So where you'll be is crucial. Then I'll move to the next point, which is about keeping notes. And I'm sorry, I've jumped completely ahead of one of the other most crucial things, which is be happy, be polite. Hopefully show a good mood. I hope you won't look like the, like death warmed over and scared and terrified even. Try to go into rehearsal with a good attitude, good positive, this is great. Don't put your personality outside. Show your personality, be yourself. Have patience with the process of rehearsal, especially if it's your first time. Yeah, so those are all crucial things. Now, keeping notes. So there are many ways to do this, and this is crucial because, again, time and efficiency in orchestral rehearsal process is crucial. You have to remember, of course, for every one of those people, for every one of you, there are 30, 60, 80, 90, whatever people on stage. And they're all being paid for this rehearsal. Rehearsals are expensive. And the time is, the best use of the time of rehearsal is to play, not to talk. So it's crucial that you keep notes that are concise, that you yourself can understand, and that are not excessive. And what I mean by not excessive is that's exactly why I avoid the big pad in favor of the small one. One way of keeping notes, again, it's very individual. Some composers like to turn down the tops of the pages of their score to show that something occurred here and make some note. Others like to make notes on the score, notes on a pad. But whatever it is, you need to have a quick resource. Figure out what your best quick way of remembering these these things that you thought of, because rehearsals go by really quickly. And if you have thoughts, make note of them. Do not record the rehearsal. Do not put on your phone secretly and record these things. That's just, I mean, if someone gives you permission, that's something else. You can ask, but I think 99 times out of 100, that's not allowed because of the orchestra musicians' contracts. So anyway, finding the best way for yourself to keep notes is crucial. And then when it comes time for you to give those notes, edit a lot. Pick the things that are most crucial. Now, all this, of course, is being done in split seconds. They're just, you really must have, and this is actually one of the hardest things in rehearsals, because I can barely think of something more exciting than being in a rehearsal, the potential of being in a rehearsal of your own work. And Melissa and I talked about this earlier before we met today, that it's extremely important for you to be present, not to be thinking about the future or the past, but to be in the present. And it is, as I said, it's so exciting to be there. One can be overwhelmed, absolutely emotionally overwhelmed by what's going on. Maybe if you can practice before you go in, not being emotionally overwhelmed and being present. Maybe it's breathing, maybe it's meditation. People have different ways. Maybe it's taking a walk, or well, we don't want to say having some scotch, but for some it will be that too. Something that will kind of keep you focused. And that way you'll be able to hopefully keep notes, keep track of what's going on in your mind. It's almost like you have to be in 3 places at once. You have to be with your score, with what you put in the score. You have to be present with what's going on in the music during the rehearsal process. And then you have to be slightly in the future tense to think, how am I going to affect what I need to, if any changes, any corrections, whatever need to happen when I go to the conductor or back to librarian, whatever.
For sure. There is so much here. And I just have to go back a couple steps and say, I am totally shook by that notepad size idea. I am completely enamored with like the sort of Jedi mind tricks that help people to take feedback better. You know what I mean? So that's such a great, I hope everyone takes that away, because it's such a great and practical and small thing you can do to just make it not feel overwhelming, which is great. And also what you just said about preparation, one of my favorite educators said, we spend so much time thinking about what we are going to teach. We spend very little time thinking about how to prepare the brain to learn. You know what I mean? So a lot of what you're describing here is how to put yourself in that place of presence, that beginner mindset, where you're directly in the moment. It's a very Zen kind of thing. And so whatever people practice to get themselves there, do that before. Yes, I'm underlining everything that you just said because it's so huge. So I am curious now about, the process of being in rehearsal and providing comments, right? We spoke earlier about someone who preempted the whole process, stood on the podium and spoke directly to the musicians under duress. I'm curious about how that is typically done. Are there hard and fast rules? What do you recommend?
Well, this goes along with the approach the conductors take in these situations. And this is, to be repetitive, sorry, this is where it's crucial to know beforehand or very close to start a rehearsal, which approach is best to take. Whether the conductor will ask you for comments to be given to the musicians then and there, or to him or her, or whether they're best given in a break in rehearsal for the next rehearsal, for the next day, whatever. This is very important to know, because it's not great to expect you're going to be able to go up on stage and give notes and then have that preempted. I think you should be prepared for whatever, but try to learn what the best approach, what the conductor's favorite approach is before you go into the situation. And particularly if you will be giving notes to the musicians in front of the orchestra with a conductor, that's really where the editing needs to take place. You need to say as little as possible that has the most impactful things, the points that are absolutely crucial up front, and the more subtle things and the more nuanced things, maybe those go to the librarian to, to change the piano to mezzo piano, or a couple of note changes, a couple of notes that were wrong, unless they're absolutely crucial. Those can go in, if assuming there is another rehearsal or another day, those can go through the librarian's work. There are occasionally situations, and I wouldn't suggest to expect this, where I've been able to actually put comments on each musician's stands. If I had to go to the principal flute and had something crucial, I'll just write that change and put it on their stand. But it's better to let the librarian do that in general, unless you know someone in the orchestra. Or again, you can learn so much from the people in the background are the percussionists. If you have a lot of percussion issues, a lot of times I've found percussionists to be incredibly open for the composer to go back and talk to them and change mallets without having to give that information to the conductor, or again, have to the librarian offer that information. So as I said, what's really crucial here is that you try to learn what you can before the process, so you know what the best approach to take is.
That makes perfect sense. And there tends to be common knowledge that the default is that you go through the conductor, right? That you don't go straight to the musicians unless you know that it's okay to do
That's
that.
right.
Would you agree with that?
That's right. In general, yes, I would. Now, another person that's your great friend in this is the concertmaster. They're really the person. If you have bowing issues, you want to go straight to them. You don't really have to give those notes I don't think, to the conductor most of the time. Usually the concertmaster often affects bowing issues in all the string sections. And they can also they're also a great resource for to ask them what the conductor's approach tends to be, or the best way to give the conductor information. But you won't usually see them before the rehearsal, so that's why we've stressed again the librarian, or the people you can see outside of rehearsal.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And procedurally, or in any other way, a question that's coming through is, are there any major differences in your experiences working with US versus UK or European orchestras in all the things we've been speaking about?
I'm afraid I can only speak from experience where generally I've had pieces repeated in Europe or the UK, so the materials are already in good shape. And in that case, it's either the concertmaster, or what they call a leader, or directly the conductor that I would be going to in those situations, not around to the musicians. And again, speaking to the librarian as well. I'm forgetting one really crucial point I wanted to make way back about the parts. Now, many composers are using various kinds of extended techniques, special techniques in their scores, and this may be something we'll address a little bit later about approaches to that. But one thing I want to mention that many musicians have told me, I've seen a lot of scores with 1 or 2 or even more pages of prefatory material with details about how the extended techniques are supposed to go and how they're supposed to be played. Now, unfortunately, unless an orchestra is well adjusted and used to those kind of approaches, a lot of times I've seen musicians not even look at those, or give a cursory glance at those prefatory pages. So I had been told numerous times by musicians, and this is where possible, and this is tricky for parts, very tricky because of space considerations. But I've had musicians said, we would do these if they were right in front of us. So if on the page where they occur, a little note at the bottom or right next to where, and it has to be spaced well, it has to look good. It has to not interrupt the musical flow, but to actually explain those in the most concise way as possible in the parts rather than before the parts, where they occur. Now, as I said, this isn't always possible, but anything that makes the musicians able to respond right away to what you're looking for, rather than some long ago memory that, or of a time where they didn't even look at those materials, that will help you get what you want more quickly and more concisely.
Mm. That is such a great note. And I will say, as a recovering orchestral piccolo player, the pressure is high, right? And we don't want to make mistakes. And there's so much music to chug through that I will totally back that up and say that if I have to go back into the reference notes to know how to do something, I'm just, even if with the best of intentions, going to forget sometimes. So I think that that's a really, really good point. And I'm curious about one other thing that is coming through in the Q&As. Do you have any advice for situations, particularly with smaller orchestras, where it's not possible to go to rehearsals at all? So since we're on the subject of parts preparation and how to communicate, what might you suggest in that case?
I'm not quite understanding to not go to rehearsals at all. Do you mean that you can't be there and?
Correct.
And so how to affect? I just don't understand the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so it might be, and Rain, if there's any more detail that you'd like to add in the chat, you're welcome to. But I'm guessing it's probably about just anything that you can do to help the premiere go as you're intending, which I guess probably has more to do with our.
So you mean where
parts
you're
question.
unable to actually attend the premiere or rehearsals, things like that?
Correct.
So I'm going back to the, one of the early things that we talked about. If there is that, in that case, if there's someone in the orchestra that you know, or if you don't, again, going through an artistic administrator, an assistant conductor, someone who can be your friend in the rehearsal process, who can be like your eyes in that situation. But since you're not going to be able to, the problem is that it's not as if you'll have a recording. It's not as if they'll be sending you recordings of rehearsals that you can react to. So, but it is good to have some eyes on the ground, or some ears on the ground that can kind of tell you how it's going. If it's someone who knows your music or who is involved, again, assistant conductor, that would be great. Or some musician that you know who knows you and your work, who can kind of give you a sense of how things are going.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And we did get clarification. It was around the circumstance of not being able to attend. Maybe it's COVID or travel or whatever the case may be. So that's exactly right. Very good. And so then I know we were wanting to look at how to address changes, corrections, edits, that type of thing. So we actually do have a question in the Q&A that might help guide our conversation. Is it really poor form to make a change to the piece after the first reading? For example, if you really didn't like a passage you were on the fence about and decide after the parts have been handed out and rehearsed that you want to fix that passage, is that considered very amateur or is that appropriate?
That is kind of a difficult question because one never knows if there'll be a second performance. That's the question. I mean, typically I would say maybe make that change for the second performance, but then it's really up to the situation. Is there time for the librarian to affect that change? How big is that change? Are they just more kind of cosmetic things? That is, if the flute passage here needs to be changed, something that they can paste into the parts rather easily and inform a couple of players, a few players. Is it a bigger, are you inserting 5 bars, 3 bars, or rewriting them completely, and it's going to affect the whole orchestra? That's very, very difficult to affect in the middle of a rehearsal cycle. Um, one thing you could do, it's a little messy, but you could make like a first and second ending kind of thing and say use play version with this part, and you put a secondary part next to that. And you have to number it correctly and make sure there aren't any issues when you go past that. But if you have version A and version B in effect, that might enable you to hear and decide which one, rather than suddenly giving the librarian an enormous job to add music into the parts. So that's one way, or even as an appendix, that's another way. That's trickier too, because that's quite tricky. I would say maybe the version, let's say it's nothing big, it's 5 bars, 10 bars, something like that, where you put version A, version B, and make sure it can invite some real issues, because then the musicians need to go from here to version B, from here to version A, skip version B. So it's complicated. Let's say and that's another place to involve the librarian in
For
saying, how
sure.
can I make this change most effectively?
100%. And also just advocating for that from the musician side of things. Again, the librarian getting into the part is one factor. The other factor is how close are you to the performance and how difficult is that change to execute? Because again, people are going to have spent a fair amount of time learning things a certain way. If they're needing to like completely shed a new section, or if, as you said, if the way that it's pasted into the part requires their eyeballs to go in 4 different places. I've seen situations sitting in the orchestra myself where musicians might say, I can't do this. You know what I mean? Like if the librarian hands them a Franken part. So those are all really good practical considerations to just think about, because the musicians do want to do their best job for you. And sometimes there can be limitations to that if it comes in too late, or worst case scenario in a recording session, which is another thing, a whole other thing entirely. So then I'm curious about, we've had some conversation about how the composer shows up emotionally and all of that good stuff. There can be a wide range of things, because I'm a strong believer in there is nothing that you will do that is ever more important than how you show up, right, as a human. So what are what are some of the ranges of like composer emotional archetypes that you have seen in the rehearsal room, and what effects might those have?
Well, really, I've seen every kind, from the most outgoing to the most shy, and from the composers who want to hide during the process to those that are just like gangbusters who want to run up on stage. And this is part of the reason that that we feel it's so crucial to give suggestions about about being present, being patient, and editing your comments, so that it's not such a good idea to be rushing around in rehearsal. Of course, you want to get up there quickly on the stage or to the conductor, whatever, but there's just there are protocols within the orchestra, and there just are kind of ways of acting within this very public situation, hopefully of other colleagues around, or some other people that you can kind of maybe vent some of your excess energy, or allow some of these things we've talked about, if you are a shy person, to enable you to put your kind of put your best, most public face on, and go up and just very politely and generously give your your thoughts, give your ideas, and your comments as needed. So it's really impossible to give a one-size-fits-all kind of commentary about that, but yeah, it's hard. It's really hard to do that. But I've seen all kinds and all types, and I've hoped that through presenting, through what we're doing today, that will give a general idea of how to act and how to be in these situations, so it can go smoothly and effectively.
Well, I think
One thing I want to
just
mention, yeah, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to highlight a couple of things you said earlier. The first one, be nice. I mean, certainly we've seen composers come in and be aggressive in rehearsal. That can be one way to really turn things off. So, of course, being nice and being pleasant and smiling and all of that. But then there's also the being too nice. The, oh, that sounds great. You know what I mean? Or the hiding in a blanket in the back. Like, you want to be
Yes.
careful of
Yeah,
that
that's
because you do
very,
want the piece to
very,
go well.
that's not really helpful. I mean, it may make people feel good at first, that they don't have to worry, that they can go on. But for you, that's where you also want your personality to be there. You don't want to apologize for things. I mean, of course, mistakes, if there are mistakes you made, and that's hopefully will be corrected in the parts before you even get there. But confidence is important. Neither overconfidence nor underconfidence. I mean, you've written the piece, people are doing it, and I hope you all feel good about what you've written and can show that not only that you're appreciative for the work they're doing, but that you believe in what in what you've put down there. There are a few other things I want to mention about being careful about, which will help the process. Tempi. Go over those many times, make sure they're exactly what you want, and that if there are areas that are extremely difficult at the speed that you've written, have an alternate in mind before you go into rehearsal. So you can say, it's okay if you do that 120 rather than 144 or 36. So you have some way, because you may not get everything, you're not going to get everything in the first rehearsal. You may not get everything in the first performance. It may have to wait till hopefully subsequent performances where musicians have maybe heard a recording of it and then can build on that for the next iteration. Another thing I'll mention, which is funny, I have a memory where I went into rehearsal with a composer's piece. Well, we went into rehearsal, and the first word on the score that with next to the tempo marking was oniric. ONIERIC. It stopped rehearsal cold. No one knew what this word meant except for the composer. He literally had to ask the composer, what is this? And there were other such words littered throughout the score, throughout the parts. Clearly he knew what he was looking for, but no one else did. So kind of when you ask for things or put markings, maybe they're too clever, maybe they're special words that no one knows. Be very careful about that, because that can shut things down, actually.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. And I also want to underline what you said earlier about be able to do everything. I once had a composer come into a rehearsal who had written like 11 16 bars with a septuplet inside of 5, inside of 3. It was like all these crazy things, and everyone made all these judgments about it. And he came up and could do every darn bit of it when asked, which was astounding, and also could explain why he wrote it that way, which was really, really impressive. Let's see. I see a question here from Michael. There's a lot of emphasis to appear competent and decisive. There are some times when you might be given a question where they ask, would you rather A or B? Is it ever okay to cede artistic authority on decisions you don't find critical or have opinions on, or is it better to just choose one for the sake of expediently resolving indecision?
Well, with an orchestra, you'll have 100 different opinions. If you want to cede it to the conductor, absolutely. Why not? But I would kind of say it's good to choose yourself. If they're the same, then and the conductor is more convinced by one and you're happy with that, then go with that.
Fair point. I also love to see point of view from the composer. So I think that's great. And then another question, I wonder if you can speak more about the possibility of making changes through the librarian, because I never knew this was a possibility. Is this common in professional orchestras rather than readings with student groups, that the librarian is willing and able to make edits to things like dynamics? Does one give a list of written notes after rehearsal? Is it necessary to also contact the conductor with the same list, or will the librarian do this as necessary? What sorts of edits or notes to musicians are possible this way?
Yes, big question. Once again, I would concentrate these things through the librarian. The librarian will give those things to the conductor usually. That's typical. I would be, well, oh, that's a really big question. Again, it really depends how extensive these changes, if they are, if there are a lot of subtle changes, again, those are things that the librarian can affect. If they're big, additions, deletions, major things, again, the librarian can do them, but they're just more difficult to affect. Small things are easy. I guess my question always is, how will they read out in the hall? Make sure they're going to read. If there's subtle changes, this is a judgment call. It really is a very, very hard thing to answer. So to get back to the first point, yes, changes can be made. And I would stress within reason. You have to also think, how much time does this librarian, I mean, that's their job, to affect the parts, to make things right with the materials. But and they have staffs, bigger orchestras at least have staffs. Some smaller ones, it's just 1 or 2 people. But try to be reasonable. Try to think again, will I have another chance for this piece? Can I make a lot of small, subtle changes? Will I really hear them out in the hall? Make sure, if they're all absolutely necessary, just talk to the librarian and say, how much can you do here? Can you do these changes? Should I edit these so that there are fewer? Ask for their opinion actively.
Yeah,
because again,
that's great. That's great. And I have one more question from me that I wanted to make sure that I asked of you. When we first had our listening session with our earshot composers, they mentioned many things. 2 of them really stuck with me. One of them was that with orchestras, it's hard to form a personal relationship with the performers who are playing your music because you're often going through the conductor. So we've addressed that somewhat. And the second one is about how we deal with it when we have music that doesn't really fit the mold of what orchestral musicians are looking to see. Maybe the notation is experimental. Maybe it requires improvisation. We had some composers who said, I write a little bit simpler when I'm writing for orchestra than I do in other contexts. And I'm curious, as a person who trains composers to do this work, particularly with large ensembles, how do you respond to that question? Do you feel like we need to always be thinking about what the orchestra can do in that circumstance, or is there a way that orchestras can create space for creativity?
Yeah, something I always wish for, and it's rare, far too rare, is to have a laboratory orchestra. I wish there were more of these situations in schools, which is where they really should start, and where possible with organizations like ACO that are composer driven and composer focused. At least it's very, very hard for professional orchestras to find the time, and we're very, very grateful that so many have found the time for a series of orchestral readings like Earshot and others throughout the years. Now, it is best in laboratory situations where one can work on specific, on extended techniques, on things that are outside the confines of the orchestra rehearsal time. But there aren't very many of those situations. I would generally agree that what one can do with a chamber, with chamber musicians, smaller ensembles, maybe to work these things out, they have more time in general. Chamber groups, even some chamber ensembles, just simply have time. And that's what, in the orchestral setting, with so many people, with people on staff and budgets, there is tight time. So I would always say to not give up on your vision, to try to realize as much of your vision that it's possible within the confines of time-bound situations. But to also, through some of the steps that we talked about, how you show techniques, how you make changes if necessary, but most importantly, what you show to the musicians from the beginning in those parts. to put your best foot forward. But honestly, for some of these maybe more experimental things, I would try them out in other situations before getting to the orchestra if possible.
Yeah, it's
There's
almost
not
as
gonna
if
be much-
yeah, it's almost as if I slipped you a 20 and asked you to give that answer, because ACO does have a program called Collaboratory, which is coming back next
Great.
year precisely for this reason. So thank you for articulating the need for that. I think many organizations need to do work that looks that way in order for the orchestral field to be as adventurous and vibrant as chamber music, solo playing, all the places where more time is present. Speaking of time, we are at that at this moment. I want to ask you a final question, which is, do you have an advice about bowing on stage? Because we're about to bow for this workshop.
Bowing on stage. If you get a chance to rehearse it, do, or at least ask whoever, usually this is the conductor or the conductor, how, will you call me up on stage? Sometimes conductors will just have you stand from the audience. Other times they'll bring you up. Very important. Shake the concertmaster's hand. The order usually is if there's a soloist, so you kiss the soloist and then you shake the conductor's hand or give them a hug or whatever, depending upon your relationship, and then shake your concertmaster's hand and then bow. That's usually the order. And then usually you do a group bow and you have to look out of your peripheral vision to see how other people are bowing. So you bow roughly at the same time. But you can always ask what the protocol of that orchestra is. Usually it's something like that.
Amazing. And if you don't have someone else training you on your pace, just do this. Did I shine my shoes today? Why, yes, I did. It will also help you not look at people when you bow, which is also awkward. All right. Well, this was brilliant. Thank you so much for this conversation. We are really thrilled to have your wisdom and expertise here. Thank you for helping us to know how to show up, not just what to do. We greatly appreciate it. And I want to welcome Aiden back on screen as well, who will help us get to our next workshop and get to Discord after this. But please, Aaron, accept our thanks for today and for the wonderful hour we spent together.
And Melissa, thank you for also giving so much of your players' expertise in this to answer so many of these questions as well.
Pleasure. Absolutely a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. We learned a lot. I know I did. So if you'd like to learn more, we will be back on April 6th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a webinar about orchestra unions with Joseph Kluger and Elena Dubinier. So that will be, I'm sure, extremely helpful and interesting as always. Thank you again, not only to our panelists and to all the composers here who have contributed questions, but to our funders for making this possible, the Virginia B. Toolman Foundation, the Stephen R. Gerber Trust, NISCA, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and our individual donors. So if you have a moment, please do fill out our survey so that we can create more webinars around topics that you're interested in and that you'd like to learn about, such as this one today. And we will be seeing you on the 6th. Thank you so much.